All right, I have 11 o'clock, so we will begin. So welcome to the 168 people that are here so far. Just went up to 175. Okay, that goes fast. To the Varroa Mite IPM program for New England beekeepers. I am Jana Hexter. I work with the Northeastern IPM Center, and this is going to be a fun webinar. We have a series of webinars, the toolbox webinars, that are meant to leave you with a really practical tool of implementing IPM. And we have absolutely two wonderful people to speak about this, who are both passionate, knowledgeable, and really enthusiastic about this and funny. So I promise you'll have a good time. And so I'm just going to go through some introductory housekeeping pieces, and we will get to the presentation. So let me just make sure I can scroll through here. Okay, so there will be a recording of this webinar, and it will be posted on our website probably in about a week. And I will send an email to everyone who's registered for this webinar. I'll send you a link for the recording. And don't panic if you don't get it today. It's going to take a few days for us to edit it and upload it. And there is the link, or if you just go to our website, you'll see it too. And also on our website are copies of recordings of other webinars that we have done. And oh my. There we go. So we welcome your questions at any time, and we have a lot of people on the call. So what we ask you to do is to use the Q&A feature. So please try not to use the chat feature, because it's much more difficult for us to keep track. So if you put questions in the Q&A, we see them as they come in, and we can answer them live in verbally, or we can answer them in writing. And also it helps us to sort out when there are duplicates, because I'm sure there'll be duplicates. And you can also submit a question at any time during the presentation, and you can do so anonymously. There's a checkbox there, so if you want to ask a stupid question or a question you're a little concerned about, just put yourself in anonymously, and we're happy to answer that. So, and our two presenters today are Kim Skyrm and Jennifer Lund. And Kim Skyrm is the Chief Apiary Inspector and Apiary Program Coordinator at the Massachusetts Department of Agricultural Resources. She's a scientist by training and a hobby beekeeper. And she has experience in academia, industry, and now government. And she's always been driven by an intense love of bees to serve in roles supporting bee pollinators, informed by the latest scientific research. So that's exactly what you're going to get today. So welcome, Kim. All right. And Jennifer Lund is the Maine State Apiarist and has over 20 years of entomological experience. She's worked on many beekeeper honeybee projects, including a national colony collapse disorder study, honeybee colony health comparisons of top bar and Langstroth hives, integrated Varroa Mite control effectiveness, and the role of honeybees as vectors of blueberry disease, sublethal effects on colonies to low-level pesticide exposure, and health of migratory hives arriving in the state of Maine for blueberry pollination. She also has several hives of her own that she maintains on her farm in Maine. So welcome, Jennifer. So it looks like she is muted at the moment, but there she is. All right. So what we're going to do today is cover honeybee health, Varroa Mite, biology, a case study, and sampling and management, an IPM program grant that Jennifer and Kim have been working on, and future and next steps. So we have some questions for you as we're about to begin. And can you start the poll, or do I need to do that? Okay. Yeah, okay, let me just, I'm going to launch the poll right now, and you should see the poll on your screen. There you go. Okay, and so these are just some starting questions, so we have an understanding of who is on the call and what your level of knowledge is, and so that we have a good sense of the best way of tailoring the material for you. So I will give you like 2 minutes just to scroll through, and there aren't any dumb responses. We just want your responses. So don't feel intimidated. This is not a Cornell University experience. It is simply asking you some questions so that we have a good sense. And I will be quiet for a few minutes. And about 65% of you have had a chance to submit. So I'm just going to wait for probably 30 more seconds, and then I'll share the results with you. Okay, well, it looks like we have 72%, so that's good enough for us to go. And I'll end it and I can share the results with you. And we're actually not going to go over the correct answers right now because they'll be covered in the presentation, but I did want to point out to you that about 27% of the people on the call are not knowledgeable at all. 46 would say somewhat knowledgeable, and about 26% are moderately or very knowledgeable. And we have one person who's extremely knowledgeable, so great. All right, wonderful. So I will continue on right now. I just need to close that out. And here we go. So we are going to start with both Kim and Jen talking about honeybee health. And you just let me know when you want me to forward the presentation.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, everybody, for joining us this morning and taking a little quiz. I know that's a hard way to start the day, but all in the name of the love for the honeybee. So, yes, so we want to just start off. It's hard to talk about honeybee health without at least talking about trends in honeybee health, both nationally and here in Massachusetts and Maine, where we are in the Northeast. Nationally, obviously, people have seen newspaper reports and articles. The public is really getting inundated with information about honeybees, which is fantastic. I think it's been wonderful to see the change in people's response to this and knowledge level increasing. As you are probably aware, or maybe not so much, but we're still having pretty significant levels of loss, both nationally, and you can see data from the 2017, 2018, both from the Bee Informed Partnership and from the United States USDA National Agricultural Statistical Service, the NASS survey. And both of those groups tend to really focus on surveying beekeepers either through electronically through the web or through a paper survey to get beekeeper input data about honeybee losses. And so it's a really great way for us to get some more information about what's happened nationally. Unfortunately, here in the Northeast, we tend to be much higher with our loss rates, especially for the states that Jen and I represent, for Massachusetts and Maine. We generally are much, much higher. So, and I'll kind of give you a little bit of information about that. But let's first get into what sort of are the reason behind these losses. And we can go to the next slide and we'll go through a couple of these. So we'll talk a little bit about Massachusetts and Maine a little later. But yeah, so you can notice on here, this is a great sort of wheel of problems, and each one of these are a factor that causes problems with honeybee health. And it's, there's a lot of research. Some research really focuses on one part of this. Some research is really moving towards this synergistic, or these effects that are working together, because as you know, the honeybee hive is really complex. So there's a lot of factors and a lot of variables that affect their health. And there's really no one particular issue here that's causing the complete, major problems. It's really this combination of a lot of different of these issues. And one thing that you don't often see is you've seen a lot about colony collapse disorder in the news. It's not something that we see a lot of in the Northeast. And if you look at the data, it's really on the decline since it was first detected in 2006, 2007. But that alarm bell was really important. And for the reasons we just discussed about, bringing light to honeybee health. Now, pollination transport's a really interesting one. If anybody's in California or on the West Coast, or right now you may be actually snacking on some almonds, you should be very familiar with pollination needs of our crops to be able to produce these nuts and fruits that we really enjoy. But the transport of these honeybees can be really difficult for them to be part of the circuit, and beekeepers are good stewards in the practices they're using to make sure they are taken care of during the transport. But there's definitely some levels of stress that can be caused by being, on this transport circuit. So there's a lot of factors overall involved in honeybee health, and the reasons we're sort of really focusing on that today. And in general, you've probably seen a lot more research on it. So let's see, the next slide, we can talk a little bit about the issues that beekeepers particularly face. So even if you're a hobby beekeeper on this call, or not a commercial beekeeper, or if you are a commercial beekeeper or a sideliner, unfortunately, when you become a beekeeper, you're now responsible for knowing a lot about their health, because this is just a really generic list of problems that you could have in your hive. I've never seen a hive that has all of these at one time, but I definitely don't discredit that could happen. But yeah, there's a lot of issues, and it can be a little daunting. It can kind of be an oh my situation if you're just breaking out and trying to do this for the first time. So there's a lot of real major concerns around making sure that bees are healthy and trying to learn how to identify these. And so because of where we are in New England and the Northeast, we tend to do surveys. And on the next slide, you can see a little bit of that data for the survey that we do every year for Massachusetts. So you probably have also seen recently the survey requesting you to send data in for the Bee Informed Partnership survey. That survey is fantastic because, again, on that first slide, you could see that's where a lot of that information comes from, is your participation in that survey, providing data. We do this at a local level in our states, Jen and I do, because what we want to do is capture this local data, and we also want to be able to offer services and support for beekeepers based on the results of the survey. So it's a little bit easier for us to get this kind of real-time data. But I do encourage you also, again, to do the Bee Informed Partnership if you're just seeing that. So the survey you can notice on here, these are just a couple trends, kind of bigger themes, but over the past several years, I've been in my position since 2015, so not for very long, but we've been taking data from this. And the losses last year for Massachusetts, as you notice in red there, it was 50%. So again, we're much higher than the national level. That's actually fairly low. And then this year, I'm happy to report so far, we've had a little over almost 600 respondents to our survey. So it'll really blow this data that you're looking now out of the water, but we're only around 35% loss. So it's much huge change this year over years past. But you'll notice the losses that were attributed to on the bottom of the slide, these are the beekeepers selected from the survey, these areas that they were attributed to them as the main factor of their losses. And you'll see Varroa mites for the 2017-2018 was very high as a possible factor that caused losses, as well as for us right in the Northeast with our winters and our really intense seasons, environmental factors. But yeah, the Varroa mites are really what we're going to focus on today. And we see this from our survey, the need for more support around this because of the level of loss. And I'm going to turn it over to Jen, and she's going to tell you a little bit about Maine. Uh-oh, I think you're muted. Oh, yeah.
There we go. Got it. So welcome, everyone. Yeah, so I'm Jen Lund. I'm the apiary inspector from Maine. And our losses are very similar to what they see in Massachusetts. This past year, 43%, the year before, 53%. And it's really, you know, we find it all throughout the state. Different counties have different losses. Go ahead, next slide. And a lot of ours, I can't control this, can I, Yana?
No.
Okay, go ahead and press.
Huh?
Go ahead and press.
Okay. Yeah.
Oh, there we go. Yep. And keep going. So you can see our losses, a lot of them are due to Varroa mites and viruses. And this again is the same as Kim's survey, where we asked people to let us know or predict or figure out what caused their hive losses. And so Varroa mites and viruses really cause quite a bit of them. I suspect the unknowns, so hit the button again. Both are also, a large proportion of those are Varroa mites, and then also wheat going into winter, that 29%. But again, environmental factors do play a role in New England. So next slide. So I also do, as part of my position, I do a lot of hive autopsy. So when somebody loses a hive, I go out and help them figure out what caused it. And we do find that about 25% of those losses are something to do with the queen issue, starvation, a poor winter, and that's not a poor winter that's cold, but one that fluctuates in temperature kind of dramatically. But about 70% of it is due to Varroa mites and viruses. So it is something that our beekeepers are constantly struggling with. And so, yeah, so next slide, sorry. And then also nationally, we see the same thing. Varroa mites, this was from the USDA Beltsville lab, where all of you send all of your samples to get analyzed for nosema and foul brood and Varroa mites. But you can see the Varroa mite samples down below. Their average counts were 20.5% infestation in their alcohol washes, which is very high. And their highest count was 240%. So that's 2.5 mites per bee, which is outstanding. So I know. So that brings us to our next section.
That data never gets old. I get the same surprise happens every time I see it. Yeah, every time.
All right, so we have a little bit of time for some questions, and we've had quite a lot of questions come in. So I'm just going to ask this one that's right here. Is there any evidence to support the use of rhubarb leaves as a Varroa therapy?
Jen, do you want to take this one, or do you want me to take it?
No, we really, over the years, many different things have been tried. Everything from putting hops in supers and sops plants and rhubarb and different things in the smokers, and we really just don't find that they work at all. So it's better to use the approved products that are out there for controlling mites.
And I think, most importantly, even if you try these products and you try these methods and you feel like there's making a difference, we really, in order to be scientifically sound, we need repetition. We need, more data than just one hive or one time or one, treatment. And we also, so scientifically speaking, we need, unfortunately, a big data set to say something really positive about these treatments. And it's just not available, which is a bummer.
Okay.
So, yeah.
And another question is, are additional steps recommended, for example, more frequent alcohol wash, etc., if I have a treatment-free beekeepers within a 3-mile radius?
Yeah, well, I'll actually talk a little bit about that later on in the talk. So, yeah.
Okay, great. So I'm actually thinking quite a few of these questions are actually going to be covered in the next section. So let's go on to the next section, and then whatever is not answered, we can move ahead. So, so Jen, you're going to be talking about the Varroa mites here in this section.
I will, and if any of my Maine beekeepers are watching, this is, you guys all know what's going to happen during this one. So enjoy for those of you who've never seen it before. So Varroa destructor is the Varroa mite that we have problems with. It was originally discovered in 1987 in the United States in it's a small red brown triangular mite. And it feeds off the fat bodies of adult pupal and larval bees. So we find it on all different stages of the bees. And it's one of the largest ectoparasite to host relationships. So it's very large compared to its host. It's about the equivalent for a normal sized human being of about a 5-pound tick attached to you. And so it's quite large. And these bees can have, you can see on the bottom picture, that one has 3. They can have 4, 5, 6, 7 of these mites at any given time. So imagine walking around with 30 pounds of ticks attached to your body, feeding off your vital fluids. So mites have 2 phases to their life cycle. They have a phoretic phase, which is a fancy word for moving around, and a reproductive phase. In their phoretic phase, they're feeding on your adult bees. And so when your bees are out foraging, these mites are on them feeding. Usually, most often, they're feeding on the underside of your bee, in between the abdominal segments. So we often see pictures with mites on the backs of bees, and that's a very, very small percentage of the bees, of what the mites are doing in their phoretic phase. Those are mites that are looking to leave the bee and either go on to another bee to transfer bees, or to go into a cell and start reproducing. And so these mites will move to uninfested colonies through bee drift. So if you have a hive that's relatively clean of bees, you may read in your bee books that bees do not visit each other's hives. If they go into the wrong hive, they fight till their mortal death, and nobody survives. That's actually not true. Bees are very social. They're just like us. If somebody shows up at my house with a pineapple cake, you all know I love my pineapple cake. Even if they have the Jason mask, a knife, I'll let them in. I'll say, oh, you brought a knife, excellent, to cut it, come on in. And it's the same with bees. If they come and they are loaded down with forage, with nectar and pollen, those bees at the door will let them in. And they're feeding off of these fat bodies on the bees, on the undersides of bees. So they're held kind of where we hold our fat bodies. And what they're doing is they are regurgitating into the bee, because the fat bodies are thick. And so the mites are regurgitating into the bees. So they're pretty much throwing up into the bees and digesting the fat bodies and slurping them back up. Fat bodies are very, very important for insects. They serve 9 or 10 different functions. Some of those they act as the immune system of bees. So if a pathogen comes into the bee, the fat bodies help neutralize that pathogen. They also serve to detoxify toxic substances that come into the bee. So they'll break down these toxic chemicals or toxic products and then make them less toxic. They also can be used as a backup energy reserves in times of need. And so they're really, really vital for the bees. And so you have, if you can imagine, 30 pounds of ticks throwing up into your body, digesting your immune system, and slurping it back up like the perfect milkshake. So that's what's happening with these mites. And so they're really, really, really problematic. And on top of that, they also carry viruses. And so the viruses are in their saliva, in their regurgitant, and those are getting into the bees and then moving throughout the bee system, ending up in a gland in their head called the hypopharyngeal gland, which produces a substance that they mix with pollen to make bee bread. So 30 pounds of ticks, digesting your internal organs, slurping them up, but at the same time, they're giving you viruses that move into a gland that you then infect all of the food that you feed your young. And so they get the viruses. So these things can be very nefarious. So next slide. And in their second phase, the mites have a reproductive phase. And what they do is a mite will go into a cell and hide in the bee food and will produce offspring. So her first offspring is a male, and then everyone is female after that. And then as the bee emerges, they will also emerge mature out of those cells with them. So next slide. And so we can see here, go ahead and press the button a couple times. So during a normal growth period, our mites are kind of keeping pace with our honeybees, and we go from 4% to 7% to 12% infestation in a very short period of time. One more press. And this area where this star is really important for our bees. They have to be the healthiest that they possibly can during that time period. And that's because that's when we're making our winter bees, the ones that need to last for 5 or 6 months. And so if they're full of viruses and they're sick, they're not going to live that whole entire time. So next slide. So this is what a virusy kind of Varroa situation looks like in a hive. Next slide. And you can see, go ahead one more time. You can see this is a typical situation that we would see in the late fall. You see all of these mites on the bottom board, and there's really no bees left. And what happens is if it's still warm enough to fly in the fall and your bees feel sick from viruses, they'll fly out and die someplace else. So you get this net smaller populations until they can no longer keep temperature and end up dying. And so this could be really, really problematic, especially in the Northeast if we have warmer, what do you call them, falls. Next slide. Next slide. And so we really are looking for accurate sampling devices needed to determine when treatment is needed. It's a lot of people ask the question, why should I bother surveying if I know I'm just going to treat anyway? Well, we had a situation 2 years ago where beekeepers in southern Maine we had a really severe drought, and then the nectar flow really shut down. And what happened was that graph that I showed you earlier shifted about 2 to 3 weeks earlier, and people who weren't monitoring missed that treatment window, and then their hives collapsed by the end of the summer. And so the sampling really gives us an idea of when to do those samples or when to treat in order to make the best decisions to control these mites. And so visual inspections can give you an index. You can see this pupa in the bottom. You would count that as a 1 if you pulled that out of your hive. But there's actually 2 other mites there that are immature that will probably be mature when when they emerge from the cells. And so you would underestimate what you actually had in the hive. So go ahead, next slide. Here, counting on the backs of bees, you can see mites on there. Go ahead, next slide. So we count 14 mites. We might not think we have a problem, but when we do an alcohol rule, next one, we have 100 and, I can't read what that says at the bottom, 141 mites. And this hive eventually died. So it can be misleading just looking at your bees. So next slide. Looking at sticky board drops, it gives you kind of an idea of what's going on, but again, it's variable over time. If the bees are all inside and they're touching one another, they will knock off more mites, and you will actually get higher drops during times like that. Or if they're all out foraging, they might be dropping their mites someplace else, and you might miss an issue. So next slide. And one more time. And then the sugar shake. We find that this one's not as accurate during humid weather. Anybody who's added a drop of water to powdered sugar knows what happens. And we do have bees, if you get a couple forages in there that regurgitate, and you end up getting this mass of powdered sugared bees that are just really unhappy. And it's really variable. And the other thing is you do shake these very hard. And we do find that they actually don't survive the treatment as well, very well either. You might get some that survive, but a lot of them don't end up surviving. So, and then next slide. And so one more time. And so really the alcohol roll is where we find the best decision-making tool that we have. So next slide. And you can see there is some variability on what people are using, both in Massachusetts, next slide, and in Maine. We find that, I mean, even in Maine, we have 1/3 of people who weren't monitoring last year, and the year before it was about 50% weren't monitoring at all. So we're hoping to kind of move those numbers in our state. So next slide. One more time. And then, oh, go back one.
All right.
And then the other big question that we always get is, so I have mites, what do I do? There's so many different products out there, so many different ways to treat. And so part of our grant is also dealing with that as well. So go ahead, Kim.
Great, thank you. I was going to say we'll stop for some questions. I can't seem to make the slides go back today for some reason, so we'll just make it up. And there's a couple of questions here. Will mites continue to live in the hive over the winter, or does the cold eliminate them? Oh, you're on mute. I'll unmute you, Kim. There you go.
Okay. Oh, sorry, everybody. Yeah, so as Jen mentioned, these are all ectoparasites. And so once the bees have unfortunately expired or died, the mites follow suit pretty quickly. So they are reliant on the bee as a host. So that's sort of the only good thing about having a dead out or a hive that's died over the winter, is that the mites are dead as well. And when you go in and clean your hive material up, you can actually see the mites if you take some of the bees that are dead in the hive and put them in alcohol, or even shaking them onto like a white piece of paper. You can see the mites. You may even see some mites still attached to the bees that died attached to the actual bee. So it's nice to be able, I mean, it's obviously really sad and horrible and nobody wants to see dead bees, but it's nice to be able to see the mites and identify where they are located on the bees, what they look like if you've never seen them before. So definitely take an opportunity to do that if you have a dead out.
Great, thank you. And it seems like lots of people do from looking at these questions. Is there a correlation between hive survival and the number of treatments applied? And if so, how should we be testing and treating? And I think you're going to cover some of that in the next section, but I wanted to ask that question.
Yeah, so I think maybe this is like a two-parter. So there's definitely research shown that if you monitor your mite level and keep it below a threshold, that you will have better success in keeping your hive alive. Some of the researchers even have gone as far as to say is if you do 0 treatments at all, and treatments in this case is a little bit more of a broad term. So we're not just talking about chemicals. We're talking about treatments as a whole as part of this integrated pest management plan. So treatments will, and you'll notice in a couple of slides here, they include things that are chemical, that are non-chemical. And so if you do a good job of keeping your mite loads below a threshold, it should definitely increase your ability to keep the bees alive. However, we have had instances where people do a really holistic treatment plan or integrated pest management plan and a regimen of treatments to control mites and get them below the threshold and have still had losses. And unfortunately, at that point, it's really difficult, right, to pinpoint the losses. But I think if you do at least try to keep them below the threshold and do as best you can to maintain that population, you will have much better success than ignoring mites completely and just assuming that they will go away or it's not a problem. So yeah, I hate to be that bearer of bad news, but Varroa mites are very, very rampant in honeybees. Yeah, if you think you don't have them or you think that you're not sure, you have them. So sorry to tell you that, but yeah, you definitely have Varroa mites. You may never see them. It is very hard, as you can see on that slide, to see them on the bee itself. But you definitely, if you're looking for them only on bees, it'll be a little difficult. So definitely take the due diligence and do a survey to see how many mites you have. Okay. I think there was another part of that question maybe I didn't answer.
Yeah, I think it'll come up in the treatment. So yeah. Actually, we've had this question a couple of times. Is it okay to use honey frames from a Varroa dead hive in a healthy hive?
Yeah, I think as long as you don't have any other disease issues, and from early on, I know it was a little quick in that slide, but there's a lot of health problems that bees can have. If the frame is completely full of honey or capped honey, or at least mostly capped honey and some uncapped honey or nectar that wasn't completely solidified into honey, you can totally reuse that. If the frame had brood on it, so if there were cells that were used to rear bees, just be a little cautious and make sure that you reach out to your state apiary inspection or a program or apiary inspector or local bee club and try to get a mentor or someone just to come over and take a look at those cells and make sure there aren't any bacteria such as American foul brood or European foul brood that has been harbored inside of there before you reuse them. But for the most part, if it's all honey or capped honey or open and mostly capped honey, then yeah, that's totally safe to use. The Varroa mites are all dead, so you can totally use it.
Okay, terrific, thank you. And for people to know, Jen and Kim have offered to stay past the top of the hour to make sure all the questions are answered. And we'll move on with more of the presentation and we'll stop and take a couple more Q&A breaks. But just wanted to let you know. And I appreciate some people who are answering some things online. That's very helpful, thank you. All right, so Kim, you're going to talk about the IPM program grant.
Yeah, so you've seen a little bit in, so far, obviously, you've learned a little bit about challenges of honeybees. You've learned a little bit about Varroa mites. There's a lot of emphasis being placed on Varroa mites and Varroa mite management. And just as a whole, I mean, we're seeing a lot more folks really thinking about this and considering it But what we really were missing are the things on this slide. So the first was that there needs to be more kind of boots on the ground approach, and people need a lot more communication as far as a community level and the way they're managing for mites. Because someone asked a question earlier about mites being sort of radiating out from an infected area. If a hive is infected, it could infect neighbors or within a certain mile radius, for sure. I mean, if you look at some of the latest research, they talk about these mite bombs, what the terms they're using, where hives that have really high levels of Varroa could definitely infect their neighbors. And as really popular as beekeeping has become, we need more emphasis on that level of, both accountability, right, to make sure that folks are doing what they're supposed to be doing and don't affect their neighbors, and also, most importantly, support. So the communication really was missing for what we were seeing, at least locally. And then also the educational piece. So, I mean, a lot of you are asking really fantastic questions, and I think they're so important to understanding more about mites and more about sort of how you go about doing some of these practices and implementing this in your own hives. Because it's one thing, right, to read this stuff and listen to it, but it's another when you go out, you put your bee suit on, your smoker, you're standing there, you're looking at the bees, and you go, oh, what do I do now? Okay, this sounded good, but now I don't know what to do. So we needed more of that kind of educational piece of breaking down what was written, making it a little bit more easier for people to digest, and then making it, to the next level of how can they implement it. And then the last thing we really were lacking in the data, and why we applied for this grant, and we're really happy we got it, is that the Northeastern bee season, for folks here from the Northeast know, it's very different than other parts of the country. So our season's really short, our needs are really different. And as such, we have to think about our bees and bee management much more holistically and in a different way. And so if you're reading things online or you're watching YouTube videos and they're made in other parts of the country, you have to be really mindful that they may not apply to the Northeast. We just have very different seasons. And then in addition to, we see a lot of this in Massachusetts, where we have people that are managing all different types of hives. So we have folks, not just the Langstroth sort of 8-frame or 10-frame model, but we've got folks with Warre hives, we've got people with top bar hives are really common, and then we have these AZ Slovenian hives, and of course we have folks that are modifying and just coming up with their own hive design. So it's really difficult in some of these treatments if you're reading labels or you're trying to figure out, what does it mean if I'm reading this and it says brood box, or number of brood frames, or whatever, how do I put this on, or what do I do with this, or even basic, how do I get enough bees out of here to do a count? So on the next slide, you'll notice we took kind of a unique approach to this. We gathered all this information. Jen and I were talking, and we were like, wow, there's some huge needs out here. And we said, why don't we just give it a shot? We'll try to apply for this grant. And sure enough, we were funded. We're really happy about this because we got the grant last year. We were able to so far have distributed, I think, Jen, you're probably getting close to this, but we definitely, in Massachusetts, we've given out some jars before the grant as kind of a pilot program, and it was really well received. So we decided to include this as part of the grant. So the goal was that we would give out 3,000 jars between Maine and Massachusetts. In addition to, we took the latest Varroa Mite literature and condensed it down to a very small table, so people could just go in and make real quick decisions based on what information was there, with the caveat they could read these longer documents later as a backup. But we've given out so far of printed, I think we definitely have given out 5,000, because I know we need to do another printing. So, and people have went completely, they have loved this. This has been very well received. People really like the idea. And I know this may sound a little silly to some folks, but if this is the way it's packaged, is that you get a ball jar, the screen is affixed to it. You have the system that you can use to monitor for Varroa mites. And in addition to that, probably the best part of this whole the little kit is what we're calling them, is that the directions for how you do this is on the jar. So you don't have to find another piece of paper or remember something or bring your computer out to the apiary. And then we've also included in additional materials, because like I said, there's a lot of groups that are doing this, and they're providing a lot more information than we put into that brochure that comes along with the jar that you'll see on the next slide. So we have materials in there from the Honeybee Health Coalition, which is really a fantastic website for people who haven't visited that. Definitely check them out. They have the go-to version of how to manage and control for Varroa mites, a lot of videos and written materials. And then the other is, again, for the Bee Informed Partnership. So there's two really nice pieces to that. We'll talk a little bit about that. So on the next slide, you'll notice the first thing we needed to do was, even though we kind of had an idea of what we thought people needed or they were lacking, we kind of wanted to do a little bit more intensive information about what specifically we could do in the grant. So we put out the survey to beekeepers, and we got a lot of response and information about, more importantly, right, that number one missing piece, which is what are the ways that they would like this material communicated to them. And so it was great for us to hear that. So from that, if you go to the next slide, you'll notice we said, okay, we're thinking about Varroa Mite IPM as a whole. This is kind of where we need to back up, because the idea of integrated pest management, or IPM, for a lot of people is really foreign. It's not something that this isn't jargon that we see. This is not lingo, language that we're used to. So we've had to really start back on what that means. And I mentioned it a little bit earlier, but it's not just about using chemicals, right? It's about surveying for a pest, in this case, our Varroa Mite and a parasite, and getting an estimate on their population level. And then from that information, you make informed decisions on how you would like to go about providing management to control this level of parasite. And so with this integrated pest management approach, it's not just about going straight to chemicals or straight to one type of control method. It is integrated, right? You have to bring in lots of different pieces, because as Jen explained, this particular parasite is really unique in how their life history has fit into the honeybee life history. So if you're just targeting one life stage, or you're just targeting one point in time in their development, you're not going to be able to get a really good control overall. So what we did is we took the materials that were available. If you go to the next slide, you'll see we made this brochure, which again is just there's nothing really new on this brochure, except we took material, we digested it, we made it a little bit easier to get sort of a one-stop shop, abbreviated version of what's available. And then if you go to the next slide, the most important part of this, and I have a lot of beekeepers that take one of these brochures and they'll put it in their bee kit little toolbox, or wherever they store their apiary supplies. Hopefully not putting it in your smoker, but if you are, you got to do what you got to do. But yeah, they put it and hold on to it as a reference. A lot of people put it on their refrigerator, but it gives you just a quick little area for you to go to think about how you're going to treat your bees. And so I alluded to it earlier. So treatment's not always chemical, right? So you'll notice on here, there's a couple different partitions. The first section, those are chemicals that are they are what I like to term as hard chemicals. So they're not organic in any way. The second section, those are the chemicals that are going to be organic in the sense they're based from plant material. So those are your thymol-based products. And again, the third section, those are also organic materials. And most of those are acid-based materials. So they're kind of broken up for folks in sections as far as horizontally across the chart. And then below that, underneath that really thick black line, those are all the things that you can do that are cultural. So those are the things that don't require chemicals. And those are a lot of very interesting things that you can do or doing in addition to other treatments that you may want to use that are in this chart. So you don't just, again, we're integrated. So we don't just choose one. You want to have a really nice sort of attack, right, against these Varroa mites. And so to assist bees as best you can, you got to be really holistic in this, and more importantly, really intentional about how you select which treatment you want to use, or treatments, when you use them. And then more importantly, if you're using a chemical treatment, and I know a lot of people have sort of learned this whenever we talk about it, is that you do become a pesticide applicator. These are pesticides if you're using the chemical version of these treatments. So if you're a pesticide applicator, you have to practice all the good stewardships of being a pesticide applicator, which is reading the label, making sure you understand what equipment that you need to apply the material, and then also making sure you follow the directions, because the label, you probably have heard this, is the law. So if you're applying these chemicals, you need to make sure you do that. If you go to the next slide, you'll notice we did these to make 3,000 jars. Whew, this is a task. So here in Massachusetts, I have an apiary program that has 4 inspectors, and they were I was doing this originally at home in my living room, which is not really easy on your personal life to have screen everywhere and clippers and cats. And yeah, so we were able to take this and bring it to the next level, and the inspectors were able to make these fairly easily. So we have the system down now. They can make about 100 of these jars in an hour. And you'll notice this literally is nothing fancy. You could use a pickle jar, you could use a mayonnaise jar. It doesn't have to be a ball jar. It can be plastic. It doesn't have to be glass. These were just easily available. The key to this is having that lid. So if you go to the next slide, you'll notice the jars have a 2-system lid. So the first is the solid lid, right? So if you think of like a standard canning jar, you have that solid insert that you can take out. And then on top of that, you'll see is a screen. So the screen is the key to the whole system. So the screen is awesome because it allows you to filter. So the goal here is that you would collect a half a cup of bees, which are approximately about 300 bees. You want to get these from a frame that has brood. Make sure you don't have your queen on there, so you're going to need to do a quick scan to make sure you don't grab her. You're going to tap that frame of bees into a container, a little wash tub that you get from a cheap dollar store or something you may have in your house. And then you're going to scoop those up like you're scooping up flour or rice into that half cup measuring scoop, and then pour them inside of this jar that contains a little bit of alcohol. Usually about a half a cup works well. And then, of course, once you put them in there, the bees are going to die. They're going to expire, but also the mites will die if they're on the bees. So it gives you a chance to be a little destructive in your surveying method, but it's very accurate because you're going to kill both the bees and the mites, and therefore you can get a really good sample of how many mites you have in. Now you do this obviously with the jar open, then you put the lid on that's solid. You can leave the screen lid on if you want. And then once you shake this up a little bit, a few times, give it a good shake, and then you leave it setting. Typically I see beekeepers will just leave it setting right on top of the hive. They'll close the hive, put the frame back in, everything, and leave it setting. And then you come back to it, you take the solid lid off, and then you have this really nice screen. So you just sieve it through. And so the alcohol should come out, the dead bees should stay inside the jar, and with the alcohol, the mites should also exit the jar. So you get a chance to get a real nice sample from your hive. And that sample, we're going to sort of estimate, it's about 300 bees. You could count them if you want to get an accurate number, but that once you do that, if you go to the next slide, you can see this in process. We do a lot of hands-on teaching beekeepers how to do this. And you'll notice, all these beekeepers are suited up, but it's really not, bees don't get aggressive at you. This is not like a scary thing. This is really something that you should do continuously throughout the season, not every day or every week, but definitely at least once every couple of weeks, and at the very least, at least once a month to get an estimate on how many mites you have in the hive. So that number that you're going to get, so say we did this and we got a number that was, let's say we got 0. So at that point, if you have no mites, right, you wouldn't need to hasn't met that threshold where you need to make a decision about doing a treatment. So you don't need to manage anything. Say we did the alcohol wash in your hive and we got a number like 20. Well, at that point, you would probably already see some issues with your bees. When levels get above the threshold of 9, so 9 mites in your half cup sample of 300 bees, at that point, you've really reached a treatment threshold where you really need to think about doing a treatment because it's above what the bees can handle. So the pressure of the pest or parasite is much higher than the bees. If you stay below 3 mites, so if you go from 0 to 3, then you're actually in a pretty good range. But quickly, like Jen pointed out earlier, if you're at 0 mites or 1 mite, that can really jump up. So don't assume that if you've done an alcohol wash that you're good for the season or you're good for 3 months. You need to continuously be on top of, sampling for this. If you go to the next slide, you'll notice once you get your number, the Bee Informed group has this really fantastic website that you can put in your data and you can actually see other beekeepers around you, including yourself, what numbers they're getting from the sampling. So you can have a really great communication method, again, of sort of more of a local view of what's happening in your area for Varroa mites. Every year, this group, the Mite Check website will send out, typically in the fall, they'll send out really a lot of information about how to do this, and they're trying to create like an annual Mite Check day. But even though you participate in that, you need to be doing this much early on. So there's been a couple questions in here I've noticed through email from folks who say, I want to do a Varroa mite treatment. I just got my bees. What should I do? Or do I need to do a Varroa mite treatment? So don't always think about needing to do a treatment. Think about what is the level of mites in my hive. And Jen has a great little one-liner that she uses with this. So, and I've met other inspectors as well. When they meet a new beekeeper, the first thing they'll say is, they won't ask their name, they say, what's your mite level? So it's kind of like, like if you were doing a dating profile, that should be your one-liner in your dating profile. I don't want to date anybody with bees that have mites above 9, right? I'm being silly, but you definitely want to make sure that this is information that, you gather throughout the season so you can make these informed decisions. Yeah, I think this is it for this section, but we can go to the next. We'll talk a little bit about how we've done this, but this was the need we saw.
Okay, and maybe we can just take a couple of questions. and we will try and wrap up by noon, but clearly there's more questions to go over. Is the threshold different depending on the time of year, for example, in mid to late summer?
Jen, you want to take this one? Uh-oh, I think you muted.
I'll unmute you.
What, can you read that again?
Sure. Is the threshold different depending on the time of year, for example, in mid to late summer?
Yeah, I usually, it is. So you want to start off your year in the spring as low as you possibly can with mites, because if you don't, you'll be kind of chasing them the remainder of the year. And so in the spring, I tell beekeepers that a lower mite load, below, actually, you know, if you're in the 0, 1, 2 range, that's probably where you want to be. And then in the fall, again, during that time period, you want to be where you're making your winter bees. You want to make sure that your mites are as low as they can be, so that you're not running into virus problems. So when we start seeing really serious viral problems so 9 is the threshold for treatment. If your mites get up to the 15 or 5% infestation, that's when we start seeing things like twisted wing, and we see our dark shiny bees, hairless bees, bees with that are trembling and things like that. And so that wiggle room, there's not much there. So really keeping them low is important. So start off very low, and then make sure that you're staying below that 9% the remainder of the year.
Okay. All right. And then a very practical question. What type of alcohol and what screen size should you use?
Any alcohol will work. Just plain old rubbing alcohol, 50, 70%, 90%, whatever you can get at the store works fine. And then it's a number 8 size screen. Mm-hmm. So it's sometimes hard to find. You won't find it at like Home Depot or Lowe's typically at a larger place, but some of the kind of hardware stores, the local hardware stores will have it.
Yeah. And if they look at you silly when you ask for screen and try to give you like a door screen or window screen, ask them for hardware cloth. So I've had to use that word, hardware cloth. Hopefully my accent's not confusing that, but yeah.
But it's not like the 1/4 inch or anything. It's much smaller than that.
Yeah. Very small. So,
okay.
And I think we're going to, maybe Yana will talk a little bit about that screen potential for folks who are interested in one.
Yeah, I was going to say, I should mention we're going to offer to send screens, the jaw tops to people at the end of this. So great. Well, let's finish up with the rest of the presentation, and then we can answer the rest of the questions.
Yeah, so we obviously had this deficit, and now we're at the point where we figured out sort of what was needed. We got a good idea, giving some information and making things available to support what was needed. The next step is doing more hands-on type things, which is what people need a lot of. So it's one thing, again, to read things and see them, but if you go to the next slide, we're going to start doing more of this kind of interactive workshops. So we're going to partner here in Massachusetts, and then we'll do the same series of workshops in Maine, where we offer folks the opportunity to come and join us for a day. This is a day long, and we'll give lunch and everything. And it even looks like we'll give you a free bee themed T-shirt. I don't know, that's worth coming if nothing else. It's actually a cool one. I just saw the logo for it, but it's a great opportunity for you to get into a space. And what I think is hard for us nowadays is to take time for you to think about your bees, think about what you want to do in your apiary, sort of the goal of having honeybees, the goal of your apiary long term. What does it look like to get there? And having an integrated pest management plan is critical to having honeybees. You have to have one. So we're going to give you a space to think about that, give you some ideas. And then also, more importantly, we're going to go through this and give a lot of chances for hands-on and dialogue, and taking what you're doing in your integrated pest management plan, your IPM plan, and applying that in the setting. So we are going to go through a series in this workshop where people can put on mite treatments. They're not going to be actual treatments, but very similar to it, what the material looks like, how to apply it, what equipment do you need, what does the label look like, and walking through this process hand in hand as much as you can without having honeybees. The next thing you'll notice here is we're getting some preliminary results back, and I'll let Jen talk a little bit about the ones that are coming in from Maine. we're trying to figure out if this is working. So this idea of having this program and offering these materials and workshops, is this creating any more information for people and providing support? So you'll notice on the next slide, we can go there, and I'll let Jen do a little bit about her results from Maine.
So yeah, so I showed you these numbers earlier. With a half to a third, we're not monitoring. So I started back in 2016. So that 16, 17 is the first year of data that we have. So go ahead and press the next slide. So in 2018, I spent a lot of time talking about this topic. I gave 39 presentations. I'm a department of one, so so it's a lot. And then go ahead and hit it again. And then so far this year, I've given 15. So I'm on record, I guess, to go further. And then our numbers are actually showing some really positive stuff. So this is all preliminary. Go ahead and press the button again. We've distributed about 800 of the jars, so we're more than halfway there. And then press it again. And so far we have our survey out right now. So if you're in Maine and you haven't participated in the survey, it's found on our Department of Ag, Conservation, and Forestry page, and you can fill out your management survey for the year. We appreciate the data. And so far our data is coming back, and about 81% are now monitoring, and 50 are using the alcohol wash. And so that's up from 19% just the year before. So I think things are happening and things are changing, and a lot of people are using alcohol wash and then also the sticky board kind of in concert. And so we're moving in the right direction. So I haven't gotten the loss numbers yet, so you'll have to wait till another webinar to see those, but hopefully our losses are down this year.
And likewise, so if you go to the next slide, so in Massachusetts, unfortunately, like Jen has a party of one person that does her whole apiary program. You're looking at it. So here we have actually 5 of us. So myself, and then I have 4 inspectors to service our state. And we're obviously able to do a lot more with more people. But the other tool that we have that we found that is so instrumental in this is sort of following up with that hands-on experience for beekeepers. Is if we can't visit your bees, you can come to us. So we have 2 state apiary locations in Massachusetts that are managed by the state, created by the state, and they offer monthly events for beekeepers. So we have beekeepers, they're free, they're open, you don't have to register, you just show up, and we'll go through all the bees with you. And I can definitely attest to the fact that it's not going to be where you show up and you see these perfect, beautiful, healthy, nothing's wrong with them bees. We're really busy. So you can imagine, very similar to your honeybees, Jen and I laugh sometimes. These are probably the most unkept bees in the state, right, or in the apiary, but I'm being silly. But they are managed very well. But it gives you an opportunity to see everything. You can see the mite treatments, you can see the levels, you can see issues in the hives. So we have a really great program here to allow for kind of hands-on inspections and education. And you'll notice if you go to the next slide, we also do the survey, and just from the results that we have this year, and again, I'm super proud to say, because we've never had this many beekeepers respond. As of this morning, we were at 583 respondents just for this year's survey alone. I mean, you can see by the arrow here, our mite wash with alcohol, using the alcohol wash as a mite survey tool, has amazingly increased. So the last couple of years, it was increasing a little, but you can see last year in the blue, for the first section here on alcohol wash, it really gave a much bigger increase. And then this year, when we really look at the effects of all the information that we gave out last year and what we're doing this year, it's been a huge increase. So to speak, the gospel is being spread about mite management, and I'm really happy about this. I think this will really benefit folks to give them more information. So yeah, I think that's all we have for folks today. I really hope that you ask questions if you have them. We'll try to get to, I think, as many as we can, but definitely join us again when we show you the other piece of this, when we've done hands-on demonstrations with people. I'll be happy to share that with you then. So
terrific. All right. So we'll kind of wrap up the official webinar, and then we'll keep answering questions. We may get a couple more in before we wrap up, but I want to be respectful of people's time. Somebody did say to share the comment that Kim comes to local beekeeping clubs to do presentations and make their presence known. So it's good to know that. And then we have a bunch of questions about oxalic acid and heat treatments, and we'll come back to those in the first time to start treating. But I want to just finish up the formal presentation because I know people will drop off because of the timing. And so I'm going to run a poll with some questions that were in the initial poll and some new ones. And also within that poll, there is the option to ask for a copy of the screen that they were talking about and showed you the images of. And if you'd like a copy, just click yes to that. And we'll reach out to you with an email getting your mailing address, because there was no place to put it in the poll, but we will be able to connect with you via email. So I'm just going to give us a couple of minutes to finish that up, and then we'll wrap up with and answer the rest of the questions. And somebody asked if you can watch this again another time. Yes, you can. There'll be a recording available next week, and you will get a link to the recording. Okay, we'll do like 20 seconds more and then I'll share the poll with you. Okay, so I will share the results. There's a knowledge question. And we recognize this was a short webinar. There's been a lot of demand for information. We will do another webinar and go into some more detail. But yes, 99% of people now know that alcohol roll is the best survey tool. And common signs of mite damage. Kim, I'm going to unmute you and you can give people the right answer so you know which one is the correct answer or answers there.
All right. Oh, let me go back in here. Oh, here we go. Sorry. Yes, so common signs of mite damage. So if you get the brochure or if you've already looked it up, some of you asked for the link, you'll notice the back of the brochure, or actually the inside, sorry. The correct answers are open or damaged pupal cells, holes in these pupal cappings, odor coming from the hive. We don't usually see this with hives that have really severe levels of mites or mite damage. This could definitely be a sign from other things, unless for some reason maybe the bees already died and there's an odor from, like, rotting dead bees. And then of course adults emerging with deformed or missing wings, for sure we see that. And you can see mites visible on the brood, but so it is a sign. But that's usually when you can see mites on the bees or the brood themselves, you have such a high level of infection that it's really damaging. So yeah.
Great. And the threshold for the limit, 3 to 9 mites, is correct. And which method would people use? An alcohol roll. And then we will send an email to the people who would like to get the mite screen and the brochure. And great. And so I'm going to stop sharing and let's dig into the rest of the questions. And Tom had suggested an advanced session and an intro session, and I think that would be a great idea. This is the first time we've done this, so we're feeling our way through here. All right, and then also Jen and Kim, if there are some questions that you can type in the answers to here as we go through these. So Mike had asked, could you comment on the use of mushroom extracts to treat variosis?
Jen, you want to talk about Jen shaking her head? No. The answer is just no. No.
Okay.
No, sorry.
All right.
This is like the after party of the party, isn't it? We're gonna get all
Yeah.
that soon.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
I actually don't know much about them. So the research is new on them, but yeah, I just don't know much about them.
Okay.
I think
Great.
I think there's some commercial stuff maybe happening with that, but I haven't seen it come out yet. Yeah, so it's new. Definitely stay tuned.
Okay. What do you think of drone foundation use? We're new and try not to use poisons if possible.
So the key to drone foundation is okay if I answer this, Jen?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So the key to drone foundation, it's a great tool, and it's definitely listed on the brochure and in general as a part of the integrated pest management plan. You can obviously purchase frames, or you could create opportunities for bees to build their own drone comb. But if you do this, the key to it, and this is where I see a lot of people really having issues, is that you can't leave it in to where the drones emerge. So we're not creating a drone nursery. We're aborting drones. We're not allowing them to fully develop. So if you use it as kind of an attractant or trap crop to grab the Varroa mites, you cannot let them emerge from the comb. You want to be able to pull that out. And it can be something super simple, like you pull the frame out, you put it in the freezer, you freeze them, and then you open up those cappings. You can also just open the cappings in the field. I mean, it's a little horrible, but yeah, so just make sure if you use a drone brood frame, do not let them emerge. So, make a little note.
Okay.
Absolutely do not forget about it, because so the mites actually can produce more offspring in drones than they can in worker cells, and that's because drones take a little bit longer to develop, and so they can kind of squeeze out one more offspring, and so they prefer it. So they will actually be drawn into those drone areas. It's kind of a lure for the mites, and that works great. But when you forget about it, you've made yourself a huge mess. The other thing just to recognize as well is that so the bees have to raise up all that drone, make that wax, all of that stuff, and it takes about 6 to 8 pounds of honey to produce 1 pound of wax. So it can be energy intensive too for your hive. I've used them very successfully in the past. I know many beekeepers who use them and love them, and they can be a really important tool to keep your levels low for longer than they normally would be by removing part of the population. So I look at mite control as a two-pronged approach. Prevention and then intervention. So prevention, keeping your mites low as long as you possibly can, and then intervening when you need to, intervention when you need to. And so prevention, one of the tools is that drone comb. Yeah.
Okay, great. And there's a question here, and it's actually related to another question, which is, I was told to treat as soon as possible since Varroa growth and spread is exponential, and treating early can drop the count for a package of bees from 50 to 5, and months later will show an impact. And is that true? And somebody else also asked a question of, when should you start monitoring and treating?
So I usually say start monitoring. So if you have an overwintered hive, start monitoring that very first full inspection that you do. So for us in Maine, it's usually late April, May. If you're in more northern parts, it might not even be till June. But you want to do one as soon and see where you're starting for the season.
Yeah. We're a little bit more advanced down here in Massachusetts, but yeah, definitely. Like Jen says, as soon as you feel comfortable enough to not cause any brood to be chilled, you're not going to damage any brood by the cool weather, you can pull out the frames, you can do a proper alcohol wash, and get your number. So remember, what's your Varroa mite count? That should be every person you meet now, even in the grocery store, just ask them. Share them. You're going to make wonderful, weirdo, fabulous friends this way. What's your Varroa mite count?
And you check monthly or weekly? How frequently?
I do monthly, and then make sure that if you do a treatment, to do a follow-up survey to see if the treatment worked. We have on more than one occasion I've had beekeepers do something and it didn't work. And so they thought the problem had been solved, and it didn't. So making sure that you're reevaluating after you do something in your hive, you do some sort of management to make sure that it worked.
Yeah. All right. Okay, great. And there's somebody has put a note here that there's a guy in England who's bred his bees to attack Varroa mites and toss them out, and he's on YouTube, so I'll let you guys follow up on that one. All right, somebody mentioned that sprouting kits have screens for bull jars. Are those appropriate to use?
I think sometimes I think sometimes the size is too small for the mites to go through. I can't, I'm trying to think of the ones that I've seen.
There's like one, the commercial, I think it may be like Sprout something is the name. That one was actually the same size. And I reached out to that company serendipitously and said, can you provide 3,000 pieces of screen? And they were like, okay, number one, who are you? This is weird. And number two, no, we do screens for, and I'm like, yeah. So yeah, it depends. There are definitely some that you have that were the same size, that 1/8-inch hardware cloth. Yeah.
Okay. What are your thoughts on the Apiary plastic hive and bottom board?
We've thought about getting one of these in the apiary. So that's another thing about the apiaries, is a good chance for us to try out all the stuff that beekeepers are using. I typically call the apiary our catalog bees, because if it's available commercially, we'll purchase it, try it out so people can see it. We haven't gotten one yet. I do have a couple beekeepers that have them. They have bees survive. They have bees that they lose in them. So I supposedly they have insulation that's built into them. I have not seen it in the apiaries yet. We haven't tried it out to see if it's something that works really well for us, but we definitely have beekeepers in Massachusetts that are using them, and their bees are making it. So, yeah.
Okay. And we have several questions about drone frames. Please talk about drone frames. How long do I leave it, the drone frame in there? Where do you place it in the hive? I'm wondering if that's something you want to cover now, or if this is something for a second webinar.
Are you going to do a preview teaser of this topic?
Well, yeah, I guess this would be, because kind of our next idea for our webinar, our next one, because we love doing these things, is to talk about some of these treatments. And I see that there's a lot of questions about them, about different management styles and different treatments. And so with the drone frames, we talked a little bit about the negatives to them and the positives, and how they can really help. Sometimes, some of your bees will be better at, some colonies will be better at drawing them out and actually doing them to fill them with brood. Others will not. And so kind of where you place them depends on how your bees are.
Okay, great. That was a short version, and I'm sure there's a much longer one.
Yes, there's a much longer one.
All right. So in the winter, is it better to take the honey out and just feed syrup instead of honey, so the bees don't have to open the wax combs?
No.
Okay.
So you want finished honey for your bees. Anything that's unfinished, well, number one, a lot of bees will not take liquid feed during the winter. If it gets cold, they won't take it, and they have to process it. So what happens is, if you feed sugar syrup, just the same as if your bees were collecting nectar, they have to bring it back, and then they need to evaporate off the moisture to it. And so if the hive is all closed up for winter, they're adding all of that moisture into the hive, and then you end up with winter moisture issues. So it's better to give them the either syrup earlier in the season, earlier in the late summer, early fall, so that they can process it properly, so it's nice and it's not too moist, or leave them with their honey.
Okay. Great. And as a new beekeeper here, he said he's just installed a package a few days ago, and he wants to start on the right foot. He's looking for information on an ideal schedule and recommended IPM. Is that going to be in the brochure and the materials that you would send for the people who asked?
So he wants a schedule for like when to treat, what to treat, when. Is that sort of?
Yeah, the ideal schedule for monitoring and treating.
It's difficult. So maybe I don't know. Can they ask a follow-up question, or can we ask them a follow-up question? I'm not sure how this works, but can we ask them what state that this person's located in?
Yeah, so Stephen Spano, if you're here, maybe you can put in what state you're in. Okay. And let's assume for now Massachusetts, and then then come back.
Yeah, definitely. And Jen, feel free to hop on this if you. Yeah, I think if we use Jen's comment about when you can do your first full inspection of the bees without causing weather issues or damage, at that point, right, you should be doing your first alcohol wash. And then once you get a mite number, somehow make a note of that. You can write it on the hive, you can put it in a notebook, put it in your phone, however you keep track of your records of some way. And that way you have sort of a baseline data for the season that you can come back to. And then as far as what you do next, so obviously if the number that you get is below the treatment threshold, then you don't need to do any additional treatments. But if it is above, you have some options. When you look at mite treatments, and I don't want to steal the thunder from the next one, but there's a lot of things you need to consider. So if you open up, I'm going to look at this brochure with you. If you open up this brochure and you're looking on the inside of the section that has the table, you'll notice on the headers, there's a couple questions that will tell you sort of how you go about orienting yourself to that guide. Number one is, do you have honey supers on? Obviously, this time of year, depending on where you're located, if you're in Massachusetts, some folks are just now putting on their honey supers for the year to get that spring flow. Typically for us, it's right around when dandelions are going in and out of bloom. It depends on the plant species and what's available for floral resources, but typically folks are just now in parts of Massachusetts putting on their honey supers for the season. So if you are going to have your honey supers on, you obviously can't do a mite treatment that doesn't allow to be put on during honey supers. So that's something you want to consider. The second and probably the most important this time of year is the weather. So if you're looking at the temperature, you need to look at the temperature for the day you do a treatment, right? You don't want to go out when it's a monsoon rainstorm, wind, and then also you want to look for however long the treatment is efficacious. So the treatment period that's also listed in that chart, the weather for that as well. Because say for instance, you put on a mite treatment and it rains for, the 14 days, or I'm being silly, whatever number of days that the bees are in that have the treatment they're exposed to, then that level of exposure is totally different than when bees are able to go in and out and forage from the hive because they don't have this inclement weather. So you have to be really mindful of what you're doing as far as treatment-wise based on the weather. So early in the season, you're actually kind of limited on what you can apply based on those factors. So if if the weather's really cool right now and you do want to put on a chemical treatment, again, these are all for chemical treatments too. If those considerations about weather, especially in temperature, then you're really limited. So, make sure you look at that. And then the other piece to it too is whether or not, besides the honey supers, is whether or not your bees are at a point where they have enough bees brood size enough to do a treatment. So say you open up your colony that's overwintered, it had a really, really teeny tiny little cluster. Say there's only 1 or 2 brood frames, but your mite load is still really high. So at that point, now you have to tailor your treatment by reading the label and looking specifically about what the label says about how much of that product per quantity, either of bees or boxes or brood frames or however the verbiage is on the label for the treatment that you're looking at. So, you have to be a little mindful about that. You don't just say, oh, I'm going to use X chemical treatment and it says I always put 2 of these on, and you put 2 of them in a box and you may have 2 frames of bees. So you could be causing a lot more damage at that point, not reading the label and following the instructions than if you were to just follow those. So it can be a little variable. Right now we are seeing beekeepers that are on our coastal areas of our state, which is always a little faster with the weather being a little bit better, flowers coming on a little bit earlier, a little warmer than the areas on the western side of our state, which is more of a mountainous area. Those folks are still much more delayed. So I'll give you an example here where I am in the western part of the state, right before the Maine mountainous area. We are just now, literally the end of last week, just had our first spring real big floral bloom flush. So we're just seeing the first bit for the season. So, we're not going to be putting on honey supers for a little bit here, but it definitely depends. So I digressed. But.
Okay, Great. Okay. So there's a couple of questions about when you first receive hives. So Bob said he lost 4 hives in 2 years due to winter, and all 4 packages came from Georgia. Is there any data showing that bee packages from New England or upstate New York are less susceptible to our winters and to Varroa Mite? And somebody else also asked, when he first got a package, he tested it for Varroa mites, and is there any recommendation on early package treatment for Varroa mites when you first receive them?
Jen, you want to talk a little bit about, oh, sorry, I didn't have the screen up.
So the question about when to sample from a new hive?
Yes, and then also the question of whether there's any evidence around getting hives from the Northeast versus from the South.
That's a tricky one. The evidence, so the research for whether northern origin hives do better in New England or the North than they do in the South, and vice versa. There's a lot of kind of differing opinions out there, but there's also a lot of differing findings with research. So it's really not clear what that would happen and how long after a hive has been kind of living in the Northeast is it considered a New England hive or Northeast hive. So there is some differing opinions, but also differing results in research as far as those things go. But as far as when you install a hive, I always suggest doing a mite wash as you're installing it, or especially out of a package, because you know where your queen is. She's in a little box, and you can't possibly put her in the mite wash jar. So you put her in, and then you can take a scoop right out of the package and sample right there and see where you're starting. And then the same thing goes for a nuke. When you're installing the nuke, you can actually take a sample, or you can let it sit for a week and then take a sample. But you may find that you have to treat kind of some of our packages need a treatment pretty soon, and some of the nukes as well, at least in Maine. And so it's good to check when you're installing it, I think.
Okay, great.
Without you and Kim.
Oh yeah, no, that's perfect. Yeah, I think a lot of the states that you get packages from down south are required by state law to treat the hives before the packages are shook from them. So, depending on what state you get your package from, it should come with some sort of health, usually like a little health sticker that tells you it's been inspected by the Department of Ag, or, the hive that it came from. And if you get that, or that information, you can also reach out to the supplier. They're very good about answering questions if you have questions about what they treated with or when they treated. With nukes, it's a little easier because you can sometimes see the signs, right? You'll see the actual treatments left in there if they apply the treatment that has physical parts for chemical treatments.
Okay. So we had a few questions about oxalic acid. One person said that she keeps her bees in a small barn loft. She's worried about using it to fume them in a small space as much as for herself as for them. And then also, does the 2-week oxalic vaporizer work as a good treatment option?
Yeah. Oxalic acid is a real popular treatment. Jen, feel free to jump in too this is our beekeepers here in Massachusetts, this has really gained in popularity quite quick over the last 2 years. So it's newly, as in the last 2 years, newly registered. So it's newly available commercially and both at the state level legally able to use. And because it offers that treatment of a package through the dribble method, it's something unique that beekeepers can do early season with their bees that has not typically been an option with other treatments that are chemical. But yeah, as far as doing oxalic acid vapor indoors in a barn, be really careful. So definitely read the label. I always caution people, real heavy caution with oxalic acid, because it is a skull and crossbones product. So it has the highest level of potential risk using it as a pesticide. So you do need protective gear to use this product, and make sure you read the label to see what that is. There's gloves, there's a respirator if you're doing the vapor method. There's also some guidelines on the label about when you're using the product under whichever treatment method, either the dribble or the vaporization, how long, the quantity. So be real careful about using that. And because it is a vapor, bear in mind, it will be something that will go through the hive fairly quickly. So if you're doing it indoors, I would be really, really cautious about doing that. And for sure, make sure that you read the label and you have the protective gear on. As far as the treatments that are multi-week, so a lot of beekeepers, if they're doing oxalic acid vapor, it's designed and set up to kill the adult mite. So that's sort of the life stage it's targeting. And because of that, people tend to like to do it every 2 weeks, as they think that, or every time, some beekeepers that do it every week, they think because they're hitting the mites that are emerging out of that underneath the cappings, to hit them on the adults. Now, I have not seen any research, and Jen, definitely correct me or interrupt me about whether it's effective. I do think we have to be really careful of using something repeatedly like that over and over and over, because again, it's not part of our integrated pest management approach. You're using only one treatment. You're really selecting for mites that may be able to resist that chemical eventually over time. And now you're going to have, potentially breeding for resistant parasite that you have no more good, technique if you were using it available to use as a single technique. But definitely you want to use other things in addition to. So if you're only doing oxalic acid all season, to sound a little harsh, just don't. It's not the only treatment that you should be using. You should be putting a cocktail of other methods, treatments, chemical, non-chemical, in your hive. So,
okay.
Yeah. So oxalic acid is a little bit unique than many of the other products that we have, many of the other miticides that we have, in that the vapor. So when you use it as a vaporizer, it really only works for when it's a vapor. So it's not long lasting. All of our other treatments, they work over time. So as bees are emerging with mites on them, they are becoming exposed to it, and those mites are dying. And so what happens is, even if you treat on a schedule with oxalic acid, we find that it's not working. It's only hitting about 70% of the mites, of the adult mites, or I guess it's killing about 70% of what you want. It's doing about 70% of what you want it to do. And so even if you're doing that repeatedly, you're still not getting good coverage each time, because you're kind of starting fresh. There's no overlap in what it's killing over time. And so we find it's most effective when you're broodless. That's when you're going to get the best treatment of that material, of that miticide, is when you're broodless. And that's what the label says. And so it's really important to follow our label instructions and our label details, because that's how they work the best. And so this is a really great, it really works well for a fall cleanup. So if you get a mite bomb or 2 or 4 or 12 in your neighborhood, that's a really good time to go in on a day when they're not in tight cluster and do a treatment then, and you're hitting all your phoretic mites, those that are on the adult bees.
And actually, this is a related question, was do mites become resistant to certain treatments? And if so, is it wise to change treatments over time?
Yes. So we've actually in the past had more miticides than we do currently, and several of the chemistries that we've had in the past have been overused, repeatedly used, and we no longer can use them. The mites have developed resistance. And so one of the things with integrated pest management is rotating kind of the miticides, that in this case, the miticides that you would use to lessen the chance of developing resistance to some of these products that we have.
Okay, great. And somebody said that when she tried to treat, the temperature spiked, and she seems to have lost one queen in all her brood, and the other hive was weakened. This was her first year, and she started again with 4 nukes. How does she do it right? I'm not sure you can answer that question from...
No, absolutely. Especially if it was something like a formic acid product. It's really, really important. Again, reading the label is really important, and following the directions. Temperature is very, very critical for that, and the 2 thymol-based products as well. If it's too hot, they can damage the hive, and especially your queen and your brood. And so you want to make sure that it doesn't have to be for the whole treatment time, but at least for the first 3 to 5 days, that you're down below the temperature that they recommend. So, which can be tricky. And so if you're going into a hot period and you want to use something that you can have on honey supers, you might opt to use the Hop Guard 2. That one doesn't have a temperature restriction, but it can also be used with honey supers. And so kind of making sure you're paying attention to the outside temperature is very important for some of these mibicides.
Okay. So Wayne asked, what if a colony is alive after winter but greatly reduced in numbers? It seems inappropriate to sacrifice 300 bees to an alcohol wash. Should we just treat, and what treatment is right for a small colony?
That's a good question, especially we talked a little earlier about small colonies or small clusters from winter. So you don't have to do like a full-size half cup, a survey. You could just do a quarter cup, or you could do one, a third of a cup. You could do something really, really, well, however small you want to get it. But yeah, you don't have to do and just extrapolate from there. So obviously you could, take the amount that's for 300 bees or a half cup as the threshold of 3 to 9 mites, right? And just extrapolate that down based on whatever size that you do. You could even get like a per bee if you wanted to, if you wanted to grab 10 bees and do it that way. I mean, it's not ideal, but I think it's better to have some level of your mite load and threshold before you can make a real decision. And I agree with you. I don't think you should kill your whole hive to do a whole half cup sample, but I think there's some options there.
But if you have a full-size hive, definitely do the 300. It's more accurate.
Yes.
And for a larger hive, I usually tell my beekeepers it's 300 now or 30,000 later, which is the true reality. And then also during the summer, to remember that our queens, a good queen is laying somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 eggs a day. So they're not going to really miss that 300 for very long.
Yeah.
So there are two related questions. Do you see any difference in mite load related to hive type? So top bar ware or frame type, foundationless, and somebody else also said about hive thickness.
Yeah, so Jen, you want to talk about thickness, or Jen's like, no,
I actually don't. I don't have very much experience with some of the alternative types of hives. I don't see them very often, so I'll leave that to you.
So we have a little bit of everything here. Probably the most common alternative type is the top bar. And I know there was a question I noticed maybe further down about doing a mite wash with a top bar hive, because it's hard, right? Your comb may not be as easy to kind of get bees off of. If you do that, you can very easily just take your jar, however you have, the container that you're using to collect the bees into, and just gently, have a frame and just gently run it down on top of the bees, and they will fall into it. So if you need to do that, you can definitely do an approach that way without doing so destructive of the comb. Now, granted, given that the different hive types, we see a lot of issues with overwintering success with some of these hive types, depending on the location. So it's a little harder to get mite numbers early in the season from the different hive types. But for people that put new packages on these different hive types, for the most part, it depends on how much comb, right? Which then translates to how much brood is available. So that's really, it's not a question so much as the type of hive allows you more mites to be developed, or is a mite nursery. It's more of the type of hive combined with how much comb is available, how well the queen is laying, how much brood is able to be produced. So it's more of that kind of piece to it. Some of these hive types are a little harder, I think, for people to get into and get a mite sample. So if you're having issues or concerns, definitely reach out. And then other of these hive types are a little easier to get into, but definitely, there's a lot of, we find here, especially there's local usually contingencies that really are dedicated to these hive types. So if you don't have a mentor, if you don't know anybody that keeps bees and you're doing this alone, bees are social creatures. Humans that keep bees are social creatures. So don't do this alone. It's better to have a mentor and a group of people that you can rely on. So reach out to other people. If you don't know anybody that may have the hive type that you have and you're trying to figure out, who may be somebody in the area, reach out to your local beekeeping club or bee group, and you can Google that in your state. Our state, for instance, we have 12 of them. How many do you have in Maine, Jen? How many bee club or associations?
I don't know. We have one Maine, or like Maine State Beekeepers Association, and then within it, several of the counties have clubs. So I can find out.
Yeah, I feel like there's a lot of people out there that are willing to talk to you about bees. So
yes.
And then the other part of this question about overwintering and insulation with the hive types, again, it depends on what people are doing. Some folks really supplement that type of hive with additional materials, whether it be something they physically add to the hive and affix it on the hive, or like an insert they put in, or something they put on the outside of the hive. Or they physically move the bees indoors in some way. I mean, maybe not in their living room, but maybe in a barn or in a shed, or something available. So there's a lot of modifications that are being made, not only to the hives themselves, but definitely to the behaviors around people keeping these different hive types. So, yeah.
Okay. All right. And I'm going to ask one more question, and I realize you guys are probably getting tired. So, but there's a question that's similar that's still out there, which is on research recommendations of treatments for New England. Is there a place where if there's that information is listed? And also people asked about, is there any research on essential oils that have been shown to be effective, and mineral oil, and fogging with mineral oil? Do you know about any research on either of those things?
So far the research on both of those are that they're not very effective, and I've actually seen beekeepers use mineral oil and kill their hives using it. So I would caution against using, again, anything that's off label, things like mineral oil and essential oils. So. Okay.
And then a couple of people asked about heat, using heat as a treatment.
So the heat treatments also can be very variable. It's interesting. So the bees don't really enjoy getting that warm. And so they do a really good job ventilating, which pushes the heat out of the hive very effectively. And so it's kind of a struggle. You're kind of fighting against the bees. They're trying to do their job, keep the heat moderate in the hive, and then you're trying to increase it. A lot of the products I've only used one or two of them that are out there, and they were just so variable with the amount that they controlled. So I don't know if Kim, if you have any other experience with them.
No, I've seen like a little, I think it's called, I used to have it on my desk. It was called like a Mite rodeo, little the door piece that you could put on. There's a lot of stuff coming out, and so what I want to do is, I don't want to squash anyone being innovative, because I'm impressed. People are getting really interesting ideas and coming up with contraptions and things, but I also think that be real cautious if you're buying some of these things, because if it sounds like it's too good to be true, it probably is a little too good to be true. So but yeah, there's a lot of things that I've seen available. The heat, I'm only one beekeeper that tried it and was unsuccessful, but I don't know the conditions around how it was tried, so I don't have enough information. But
okay. Yeah. So what I'm going to suggest is, I know you guys must be getting tired, and we have some questions that are really specific, like, where is the link to register for an event in Maine, and what are the places we can drop by. So I'm going to suggest that those questions I can ask Jen and Kim to reply to via email, and we can also post a summary of the remaining questions there too. And we had an overwhelming response to this webinar. We did not expect 400 people, so we certainly could have scheduled it for longer. So I'm going to ask one last question, and then the rest, if you're waiting and yours is left unanswered, I will ask Jen and Kim to respond to that, and via email, and we'll post it for everyone else too, just so that's there. And the last question, which has been popping up, can you, if you find mites in one hive, can you assume that it's in all the others, and you should treat all of the hives at the same time?
That's a good question. Yeah, Jen is smiling. I think there's an interesting answer going to occur out of that screen on my computer.
No, it's all you. I have to run for a second. I have to go get a call.
Come on, Jen was smiling because she's leaving. Okay, so I'm in the hot seat. So this is a tough one. If you go to some of the researchers' opinions, they will definitely tell you, for instance, if you have an apiary and you have a large number of hives, you may not either have enough materials or be able to have enough to look at every single hive. Ideally, it'd be nice to get a count on every hive. You should be taking some data, some information, some record on each one of these hives. that. If you are unable to do that, and you go into your apiary and you're seeing signs of high mite loads or high mite damage, you make inferences that you may want to treat your apiary based on that. But again, you really run the risk of having a situation where you could be creating resistant mites, or resistant, to those treatments. So Jen may have another opinion of this, but
no, I agree. I think I usually tell beekeepers, if you have just a handful of hives, it's really good experience to monitor them all. If you have 2 or 3, this technique really takes a minute or 2. It's not very long once you get good at it. And there is variability. I had a beekeeper last year that I did alcohol rolls on 2 hives, started the exact same equipment. They looked the same strength, and one rolled a 0 and one rolled a 6. And so when I got to talking to the beekeeper, we discovered that, one had actually swarmed, and that had kept the other one lower. The one that rolled a 0, that was the one that swarmed, or maybe it rolled a 1. And so there can be differences. You may not notice it between hives, but just looking at them, but there may be differences. So you may not need to treat everything. If you have a lot of hives, I usually tell people to choose a couple of representative hives. So maybe one that's swarmed, one that's weak, one that's strong, and see how you're doing kind of in those different categories, and see where you're at. So.
Yeah. All right, terrific. And I'm just going to mention a couple of things. If you are a researcher, you're interested in linking with other colleagues in the Northeast, we have a Find a Colleague link on our website, and you're welcome to go and post a profile of yourself. Obviously, Kim and Jennifer are in separate states, and this is how we like to encourage people to collaborate. The archive of today's webinar is going to be available on our website for time in memoriam, and it will be available in about a week, and I will send you a link. And we have 2 other Toolbox webinars coming up, one on how to use IPM for children to keep them safe from Lyme disease in school and suburban communities on May 8th, and industrial hemp IPM on May 16th. So please feel free to mention that in your networks. And we just want to say thank you to all of the organizations that support this work. It was the grant that we funded from the Northeastern IPM Center comes from grant funding from USDA, and of course Maine Agricultural Conservation and Forestry and Massachusetts Department of Ag Resources paid the salaries of these kind ladies to sit here for the last couple of hours answering your questions. And there is also information here on how you can connect with Jen and Kim, and or you can Google them, you have their names. And thank you for the people that have been participating, really appreciate it. And thank you, Jen and Kim, for all of your education and experience that allows you to whip off answers to these questions. All right, and that is the conclusion of the webinar.